The subplanes. If it be asked what is the real difference between the matter of the various subplanes of the mental plane, it is not easy to answer in other than very general terms, for the unfortunate scribe bankrupts himself of adjectives in an unsuccessful endeavor to describe the lowest plane, and then has nothing left to say about the others. What indeed can be said, except that ever as we ascend the material becomes finer, the harmonies fuller, the light more living and transparent. There are more overturns in the sound, more delicate intershades in the colors as we rise. More and more new colors appear, hues entirely unknown to the physical sight, and it has been poetically yet truly said that the light of the lower plane is darkness on the one above it. Perhaps this idea is simpler if we start in thought from the top instead of the bottom, and try to realize that on the highest subplane we shall find its appropriate matter ensouled and vivified by an energy which still flows down like light from above, from a plane which lies away beyond the mental altogether. Then, if we descend to the second subdivision, we shall find that the matter of our first subplane has become the energy of this, or, to put the thing more accurately, that the original energy plus the garment of matter of the first subplane with which it has endued itself is still the energy ensouling the matter of this second subplane. In the same way, in the third division we shall find that the original energy has twice veiled itself in the matter of these first and second subplanes through which it has passed, so that by the time we get to our seventh subdivision, we shall have our original energy 6 times enclosed or veiled, and therefore by so much the weaker and less active. This process is exactly analogous to the veiling of Atma, the primordial spirit, in its descent as monadic essence in order to energize the matter of the planes of the cosmos. And as it is one which frequently takes place in nature, it will save the student much trouble if he will try to familiarize himself with the idea. See Mrs. Besant, Ancient Wisdom, page 54, and footnote. The records of the past. In speaking of the general characteristics of the plane, we must not omit to mention the ever-present background formed by the records of the past, the memory of nature, the only really reliable history of the world. While what we have on this plane is not yet the absolute record itself, but merely a reflection of something higher still, it is at any rate clear, accurate, and continuous, differing therein from the disconnected and spasmodic manifestation which is all that represents it in the astral world. It is, therefore, only when a clairvoyant possesses the vision of this mental plane that his pictures of the past can be relied upon, and even then, unless he has the power of passing in full consciousness from that plane to the physical, we have to allow for the possibility of errors in bringing back the recollection of what he has seen. But the student who has succeeded in developing the powers latent within himself so far as to enable him to use the sense belonging to this mental plane while he is still in the physical body has before him a field of historical research of most entrancing interest. Not only can he review at his leisure all history with which we are acquainted, correcting as he examines it the many errors and misconceptions which have crept into the accounts handed down to us, he can also range at will over the whole story of the world from its very beginning, watching the slow development of intellect in man, the descent of the lords of the flame, and the growth of the mighty civilizations which they founded. Nor is his study confined to the progress of humanity alone. He has before him, as in a museum, all the strange animal and vegetable forms which occupied the stage in days when the world was young. He can follow all the wonderful geological changes which have taken place, and watch the course of the great cataclysms which have altered the whole face of the earth again and again. Many and varied are the possibilities opened up by access to these records. So many and so varied indeed that even if this were the only advantage of the mental plane, it would still transcend and interest all the lower worlds. But when to this we add the remarkable increase in the opportunities for the acquisition of knowledge given by its new and wider faculty, the privilege of direct untrammeled intercourse, not only with the great Deva kingdom, but with the very masters of wisdom themselves, the rest and relief from the weary strain of physical life that is brought by the enjoyment of its deep unchanging bliss, and above all, the enormously enhanced capability of the developed student for the service of his fellow men, then we shall begin to have some faint conception of what a pupil gains when he wins the right to enter at will and in perfect consciousness upon his heritage in this bright realm of the heaven world. Inhabitants. In our endeavor to describe the inhabitants of the mental plane, it will perhaps be well for us to divide them into the same three great classes chosen in the manual on the astral plane: the human, the non-human, and the artificial. Though the subdivisions will naturally be less numerous in this case than in that, since the products of man's evil passions, which bulked so largely there, can find no place here. First, human. Exactly as was the case when dealing with the lower world, it will be desirable to subdivide the human inhabitants of the mental plane into two classes: those who are still attached to a physical body and those who are not, the living and the dead, as they are commonly but most erroneously called. Very little experience of these higher planes is needed to alter fundamentally the student's conception of the change which takes place at death. He realizes immediately on the opening of his consciousness, even in the astral, and still more in this mental world, that the fullness of true life is something which can never be known down here, and that when we leave this physical earth, we are passing into that true life, not out of it. We have not at present in the English language any convenient and at the same time accurate words to express these conditions. Perhaps to call them respectively embodied and disembodied will be, on the whole, the least misleading of the various possible phrases. Let us therefore proceed to consider those inhabitants of the mental plane who come under the head of the embodied. Those human beings who, while still attached to a physical body, are found moving in full consciousness and activity upon this plane, are invariably either adepts or their initiated pupils. For until a student has been taught by his master how to use his mental body, he will be unable to move with freedom upon even its lower levels. To function consciously during physical life upon the higher levels denotes still greater advancement, for it means the unification of the man, so that down here he is no longer a mere personality, more or less influenced by the individuality above, but is himself that individuality, trammelled and confined by a body, certainly, but nevertheless having within him the power and knowledge of a highly developed ego. Very magnificent objects are these adepts and initiates to the vision, which has learnt to see them, splendid globes of light and colour, driving away all evil influence wherever they go, acting upon all who come near them as the sunshine acts upon the flowers, and shedding around them a feeling of restfulness and happiness of which even those who do not see them are often conscious. It is in this celestial world that much of their most important work is done, more especially upon its higher levels, where the individuality can be acted upon directly. It is from this plane that they shower the grandest spiritual influences upon the world of thought. From it also they impel great and beneficent movements of all kinds. Here, much of the spiritual force poured out by the glorious self-sacrifice of the Nirmankayas is distributed. Here also, direct teaching is given to those pupils who are sufficiently advanced to receive it in this way, since it can be imparted far more readily and completely here than on the astral plane. In addition to all these activities, they have a great field of work in connection with those whom we call the dead. But this will be more fitly explained under a later heading. It is a pleasure to find that a class of inhabitants which obtruded itself painfully on our notice on the astral plane is almost entirely absent here. In a world whose characteristics are unselfishness and spirituality, the black magician and his pupils can obviously find no place, since selfishness is of the essence of all the proceedings of the darker schools, and their study of occult forces is entirely for personal ends. Not but that, in many of them, the intellect is very highly developed, and consequently, the matter of the mind-body extremely active and sensitive along certain lines. But in every case, those lines are connected with personal desire of some sort, and they can therefore find expression only through that lower part of the mind-body, which has become almost inextricably entangled with astral matter. As a necessary consequence of this limitation, it follows that their activities are practically confined to the astral and physical planes. A man, the trend of whose whole life is evil and selfish, may indeed have periods of purely abstract thought during which he may utilize the mind-body if he has learnt how to do so. But the moment that the personal element comes in and the effort to produce some evil result is made, the thought is no longer abstract, and the man finds himself working in connection with the familiar astral matter once more. One might almost say that a black magician could function on the mental plane only while he forgot that he was a black magician. But even while he forgot it, he could be visible on the mental plane only to men functioning consciously on that plane, never by any possibility to those who are enjoying the heavenly rest in this region after death, since each of them is so entirely secluded within the world of his own thought that nothing outside of that can affect him, and he is consequently absolutely safe. Thus is justified the grand old description of the heaven world as the place where the wicked cease from troubling, and the weary are at rest. In sleep or trance. In thinking of the embodied inhabitants of the mental plane, the question naturally suggests itself whether either ordinary people during sleep or psychically developed persons in a trance condition can ever penetrate to this plane. In both cases, the answer must be that the occurrence is possible, though extremely rare. Purity of life and purpose would be an absolute prerequisite, and even when the plane was reached, there would be nothing that could be called real consciousness, but simply a capacity for receiving certain impressions. As exemplifying the possibility of entering the mental plane during sleep, an incident may be mentioned which occurred in connection with the experiments made by the London Lodge of the Theosophical Society on dream consciousness, an account of some of which was given in my little book on dreams. It may be remembered by those who have read that treatise that a thought picture of a lovely tropical landscape was presented to the minds of various classes of sleepers, with a view of testing the extent to which it was afterwards recollected on awaking. One case which was not referred to in the account previously published, as it had no special connection with the phenomena of dreams, will serve as a useful illustration here. It was that of a person of pure mind and considerable, though untrained psychic capacity, and the effect of the presentation of the thought picture to her mind was of a somewhat startling character. So intense was the feeling of reverent joy, so lofty and so spiritual were the thoughts evoked by the contemplation of this glorious scene, that the consciousness of the sleeper passed entirely into the mind-body, or, to put the same idea into other words, rose on to the mental plane. It must not, however, be supposed from this that she became cognizant of her surroundings upon that plane, or of its real conditions. She was simply in the state of the ordinary person who has reached that level after death, floating in the sea of light and colour indeed, but nevertheless entirely absorbed in her own thought, and conscious of nothing beyond it, resting in ecstatic contemplation of the landscape and of all that it had suggested to her. yet contemplating it, be it understood, with the keener insight, the more perfect appreciation, and the enhanced vigor of thought peculiar to the mental plane, and enjoying all the while the intensity of bliss which has so often been spoken of before. The sleeper remained in that condition for several hours, though apparently entirely unconscious of the passage of time, and at last awoke with a sense of deep peace and inward joy, for which, since she had brought back no recollection of what had happened, she was quite unable to account. There is no doubt, however, that such an experience as this, whether remembered in the physical body or not, would act as a distinct impulse to the spiritual evolution of the ego concerned. Though in the absence of a sufficient number of experiments, one hesitates to speak too positively, it seems almost certain that such a result as this just described would be possible only in the case of a person having already some amount of psychic development, and the same condition is even more definitely necessary in order that a mesmerized subject should touch the mental plane in trance. So decidedly is this the case that probably not one in 1,000 among ordinary clairvoyants ever reaches it at all. But on the rare occasions when it is so attained, the clairvoyant, as before remarked, must be not only of exceptional development, but of perfect purity of life and purpose. And even when all these unusual characteristics are present, there still remains the difficulty which an untrained psychic always finds in translating a vision accurately from the higher plane to the lower. All these considerations, of course, only emphasize what has been so often insisted upon before: the necessity of the careful training of all psychics under a qualified instructor before it is possible to attach much weight to their reports of what they see. The disembodied. Before considering in detail the condition of the disembodied entities on the various subdivisions of the mental plane, we must have very clearly in our minds the broad distinction between the Rupa and Arupa levels, of which mention has already been made. On the former, the man lives entirely in the world of his own thoughts, still fully identifying himself with his personality in the life which he has recently quitted. On the latter, he is simply the reincarnating ego or soul, who, if he has developed sufficient consciousness on that level to know anything clearly at all, understands, at least to some extent, the evolution upon which he is engaged and the work that he has to do. It should be remembered that every man passes through both these stages between death and birth, though the undeveloped majority have so little consciousness in either of them as yet that they might more truly be said to dream through them. Nevertheless, whether consciously or unconsciously, every human being must touch the higher levels of the mental plane before reincarnation can take place. And as his evolution proceeds, this touch becomes more and more definite and real to him. Not only is he more conscious there as he progresses, but the period he passes in that world of reality becomes longer, for the fact is that his consciousness is slowly but steadily rising through the different planes of the system. Primitive man, for example, has comparatively little consciousness on any plane but the physical during life, and the lower astral after death. And indeed, the same may be said of the quite undeveloped man even in our own day. A person a little more advanced begins to have a short period of heaven life, on the lower levels of course, but still spends by far the greater part of his time between incarnations on the astral plane. As he progresses, the astral life grows shorter and the heaven life longer, until when he becomes an intellectual and spiritually minded person, he passes through the astral plane with hardly any delay at all and enjoys a long and happy sojourn on the more refined of the lower mental levels. By this time, however, the consciousness in the true ego on its higher level is awakened to a very considerable extent, and thus his conscious life on the mental plane divides itself into two parts, the later and shorter portion being spent on the higher subplane in the causal body. The process previously described then repeats itself, the life on the lower levels gradually shortening, while the higher life becomes steadily longer and fuller, till at last the time comes when the consciousness is unified, when the higher and lower selves are indissolubly united, and the man is no longer capable of wrapping himself up in his own cloud of thought, and, mistaking the little that he can, see through that for the whole of the great heaven world around him, when he realizes the true possibilities of his life, and so for the first time truly begins to live. But by the time that he attains these heights, he will already have entered upon the path and taken his future progress definitely into his own hands. The qualities necessary for the heaven life. The greater reality of the heaven life as compared with that on earth shines forth clearly when we consider what conditions are requisite for the attainment of this higher state of existence. For the very qualities which a man must develop during life, if he is to have any existence in the heaven world after death, are just those which all the best and noblest of our race have agreed in considering as really and permanently desirable. In order that an aspiration or a thought force should result in existence on that plane, its dominant characteristic must be unselfishness. Affection for family or friends takes many a man into the heaven life, and so also does religious devotion. Yet it would be a mistake to suppose that all affection or all devotion must therefore necessarily find its post-mortem expression there. For of each of these qualities there are obviously two varieties, the selfish and the unselfish, though it might perhaps reasonably be argued that it is only the latter kind in each case which is really worthy of the name. There is the love which pours itself out upon its object, seeking for nothing in return, never even thinking of itself, but only of what it can do for the loved one. And such a feeling as this generates a spiritual force which cannot work itself out except upon the mental plane. But there is also another emotion which is sometimes called love, an exacting, selfish kind of passion which desires mainly to be loved, which is thinking all the time of what it receives rather than of what it gives, and is quite likely to degenerate into the horrible vice of jealousy upon, or even without, the smallest provocation. Such affection as this has in it no seed of the mental development. The forces which it sets in motion will never rise above the astral plane. The same is true of the feeling of a certain very large class of religious devotees, whose one thought is not the glory of their deity, but how they may save their own miserable souls, a position which forcibly suggests that they have not yet developed anything that really deserves the name of a soul at all. On the other hand, there is the real religious devotion, which thinks never of self, but only of love and gratitude towards the deity or leader, and is filled with ardent desire to do something for him or in his name. And such a feeling often leads to a prolonged heaven life of a comparatively exalted type. This would of course be the case, whoever the deity or leader might be, and followers of Buddha, Krishna, Ormuzd, Allah and Christ would all equally attain their need of celestial bliss, its length and quality depending upon the intensity and purity of the feeling, and not in the least upon its object, though this latter consideration would undoubtedly affect the possibility of receiving instruction during that higher life. Most human devotion, however, like most human love, is neither wholly pure nor wholly selfish. That love must be low indeed, into which no unselfish thought or impulse has entered, and, on the other hand, an affection which is usually and chiefly quite pure and noble may yet sometimes be clouded by a spasm of jealous feeling or a passing thought of self. In both these cases, as in all, the law of eternal justice discriminates unerringly, and just as the momentary flash of nobler feeling in the less developed heart will surely receive its need in the heaven world, even though there be naught else in the life to raise the soul above the astral plane, so the baser thought, which erstwhile dimmed the holy radiance of a real love, will work out its force in the astral world, interfering not at all with the magnificent celestial life which flows infallibly from years of deep affection here below. How a man first gains the heaven life. It will be seen, therefore, that in the earlier stages of their evolution, many of the backward egos never consciously attain the heaven world at all, while a still larger number obtain only a comparatively slight touch of some of its lower planes. Every soul must, of course, withdraw into its true self upon the higher levels before reincarnation, but it does not at all follow that in that condition it will experience anything that we should call consciousness. This subject will be dealt with more fully when we come to treat of the arupa planes. It seems better to begin with the lowest of the rupa levels and work steadily upwards. So we may for the moment leave on one side that portion of humanity whose conscious existence after death is practically confined to the astral plane, and proceed to consider the case of an entity who has just risen out of that position, who for the first time has a slight and fleeting consciousness in the lowest subdivision of the heaven world. There are evidently various methods by which this important step in the early development of the soul may be brought about, but it will be sufficient for our present purpose if we take as an illustration of one of them a somewhat pathetic little story from real life, which came under the observation of our students when they were investigating this question. In this case, the agent of the great evolutionary forces was a poor seamstress, living in one of the dearest and most squalid of our terrible London slums, a fetid court in the East End into which light and air could scarcely struggle. Naturally, she was not highly educated, for her life had been one long round of the hardest work under the least favourable of conditions, but nevertheless she was a good-hearted, benevolent creature, overflowing with love and kindness towards all with whom she came into contact. Her rooms were as poor, perhaps, as any in the court, but at least they were cleaner and neater than the others. She had no money to give when sickness brought need even more dire than usual to some of her neighbours. Yet on such an occasion she was always at hand as often as she could snatch a few moments from her work, offering with ready sympathy such service as was within her power. Indeed, she was quite a providence to the rough, ignorant factory girls about her, and they gradually came to look upon her as a kind of angel of help and mercy, always at hand in time of trouble or illness. Often, after toiling all day with scarcely a moment's intermission, she sat up half the night, taking her turn at nursing some of the many sufferers who are always to be found in surroundings so fatal to health and happiness as those of a London slum. And in many cases the gratitude and affection which her unremitting kindness aroused in them were absolutely the only higher feelings that they had during the whole of their rough and sordid lives. The conditions of existence in that court being such as they were, there is little wonder that some of her patients died, and then it became clear that she had done for them much more than she knew. She had given them not only a little kindly assistance in their temporal trouble, but a very important impulse on the course of spiritual evolution. For these were undeveloped souls, entities of a very backward class, who had never yet in any of their births set in motion the spiritual forces which alone could give them conscious existence on the mental plane, but now, for the first time, not only had an ideal towards which they could strive been put before them, but also really unselfish love had been evoked in them by her action, and the very fact of having so strong a feeling as this had raised them and given them more individuality. And so, after their stay in the astral plane was ended, they gained their first experience of the lowest subdivision of the heaven world. A short experience, probably, and of by no means an advanced type, but still of far greater importance than appears at first sight. For when once the great spiritual energy of unselfishness has been awakened, the very working out of its results in the heaven world gives it the tendency to repeat itself, and Small in amount, though, this first outpouring may be, it yet builds into the soul a faint tinge of a quality which will certainly express itself again in the next life. So the gentle benevolence of a poor seamstress has given to several less developed souls their introduction to a conscious spiritual life, which incarnation after incarnation will grow steadily stronger and react more and more upon the earth lives of the future. This little incident perhaps suggests an explanation of the fact that in the various religions so much importance is attached to the personal element in charity, the direct association between donor and recipient. Seventh subplane, the lowest heaven. This lowest subdivision of the heaven world, to which the action of our poor seamstress raised the objects of her kindly care, has for its principal characteristic that of affection for family or friends, unselfish of course, but usually somewhat narrow. Here, however, we must guard ourselves against the possibility of misconception. When it is said that family affection takes a man to the seventh celestial subplane and religious devotion to the sixth, people sometimes very naturally imagine that a person having both these characteristics strongly developed in him would divide his period in the heaven world between these two subdivisions, first spending a long period of happiness in the midst of his family, and then passing upwards to the next level, there to exhaust the spiritual forces engendered by his devotional aspirations. This, however, is not what happens, for in such a case as we have supposed, the man would awaken to consciousness in the sixth subdivision, where he would find himself engaged, together with those whom he had loved so much, in the highest form of devotion which he was able to realize. And when we think of it, this is reasonable enough, for the man who is capable of religious devotion as well as mere family affection is naturally likely to be endowed with a higher and broader development of the latter virtue than one whose mind is susceptible to influence in one direction only. The same rule holds good all the way up. The higher plane may always include the qualities of the lower as well as those peculiar to itself, and when it does so, its inhabitants almost invariably have these qualities in fuller measure than the souls on a lower plane. When it is said that family affection is the characteristic of the seventh subplane, it must not therefore be supposed for a moment that love is confined to this plane, but rather that the man who will find himself here after death is one in whose character this affection was the highest quality, the only one, in fact, which entitled him to the heaven life at all. But love of a far nobler and grander type than anything to be seen on this level may of course be found upon the higher subplanes. One of the first entities encountered by the investigators upon this subplane forms a very fair typical example of its inhabitants. The man during life had been a small grocer, not a person of intellectual development or of any particular religious feeling, but simply the ordinary honest and respectable small tradesman. No doubt he had gone to church regularly every Sunday because it was the customary and proper thing to do. But religion had been to him a sort of a dim cloud, which he did not really understand, which had no connection with the business of everyday life, and was never taken into account in deciding its problems. He had therefore none of the depth of devotion which might have lifted him to the next subplane. But he had for his wife and family a warm affection in which there was a large element of unselfishness. They were constantly in his mind, and it was for them far more than for himself that he worked from morning to night in his tiny little shop. And so, when, after a period of existence on the astral plane, he had at last shaken himself free from the disintegrating desire body, he found himself in this lowest subdivision of the heaven world, with all his loved ones gathered round him. He was no more an intellectual or highly spiritual man than he had been on earth, for death brings with it no sudden development of that kind. The surroundings in which he found himself with his family were not of a very refined type, for they represented only his own highest ideals of non-physical enjoyment during life. But, nevertheless, he was as intensely happy as he was capable of being, and since he was all the time thinking of his family rather than of himself, he was undoubtedly developing unselfish characteristics which would be built into his soul as permanent qualities, and so would reappear in all his future lives on earth. Another typical case was that of a man who had died while his only daughter was still young. Here in the heaven world, he had her always with him and always at her best, and he was continually occupying himself in weaving all sorts of beautiful pictures of her future. Yet another was that of a young girl who was always absorbed in contemplating the manifold perfections of her father and planning little surprises and fresh pleasures for him. Another was a Greek woman who was spending a marvelously happy time with her 3 children, one of them a beautiful boy, whom she delighted in imagining as the victor in the Olympic Games. A striking characteristic of this subplane for the last few centuries has been the very large number of Romans, Carthaginians, and Englishmen to be found there. This being due to the fact that among men of these nations, the principal unselfish activity found its outlet through family affection, while comparatively few Hindus and Buddhists are here, since in their case real religious feeling usually enters more immediately into their daily lives and consequently takes them to a higher level. There was, of course, an almost infinite variety among the cases observed, their different degrees of advancement being distinguishable by varying degrees of luminosity, while differences of color indicated respectively the qualities which the persons in question had developed. Some were lovers who had died in the full strength of their affection, and so were always occupied with the one person they loved to the entire exclusion of all others. Others there were who had been almost savages, one example being a Malay, a very undeveloped man at the stage which we should technically describe as that of a low, third-class Pitri, who obtained a slight experience of the heaven life in connection with a daughter whom he had loved. In all these cases, it was the touch of unselfish affection which gave them their heaven. Indeed, apart from that, there was nothing in the activity of their personal lives which could have expressed itself on that plane. In most instances observed on this level, the images of the loved ones are very far from perfect, and consequently, the true egos or souls of the friends who are loved can express themselves but poorly through them. Though even at the worst, that expression is much fuller and more satisfying than it ever was in physical life. In earth life, we see our friends so partially. We know only those parts of them which are congenial to us, and the other sides of their characters are practically non-existent for us. Our communion with them and our knowledge of them down here mean very much to us and are often to us among the greatest things in life. Yet, in reality, this communion and this knowledge must always be exceedingly defective, for even in the very rare cases where we can think that we know a man thoroughly and all through, body and soul, it is still only the part of him which is in manifestation on these lower planes, while in incarnation that we can know. And there is far more behind in the real ego which we cannot reach at all. Indeed, if it were possible for us, with the direct and perfect vision of the mental plane, to see for the first time the whole of our friend when we met him after death, the probability is that he would be quite unrecognizable. Certainly, he would not be at all the dear one whom we thought we had known before. It must be understood that the keen affection which alone brings one man into the heaven life of another is a very powerful force upon these higher planes, a force which reaches up to the soul of the man who is loved and evokes a response from it. Naturally, the vividness of that response, the amount of life and energy in it, depends on the development of the soul of the loved one. But there is no case in which the response is not a perfectly real one as far as it goes. Of course, the soul or ego can be fully reached only upon his own level, one of the Arupa subdivisions of this mental plane, but at least we are very much nearer to that in any stage of the heaven world than we are here, and therefore, under favorable conditions, we could there know enormously more of our friend than would ever be possible here. While even under the most unfavorable of conditions, we are at any rate far closer to the reality there than we have ever been before. Two factors have to be taken into account in our consideration of this subject: the degree of development of each of the persons concerned. If the man in the heaven life has strong affection and some development in spirituality, he will form a clear and fairly perfect thought image of his friend as he knew him, an image through which at that level the soul of the friend could express himself to a very considerable extent. But in order to take full advantage of that opportunity, it is necessary that that soul should himself be very fairly advanced in evolution. We see, therefore, that there are two reasons for which the manifestation may be imperfect. The image made by the dead man may be so vague and inefficient that the friend, even though well evolved, may be able to make very little use of it. And on the other hand, even when a good image is made, there may not be sufficient development on the friend's part to enable him to take due advantage of it. But in any and every case, the soul of the friend is reached by the feeling of affection, and whatever may be its stage of development, it at once responds by pouring itself forth into the image which has been made. The extent to which the true man can express himself through it depends on the two factors above mentioned: the kind of image which is made in the first place, and how much soul there is to express in the second. But even the feeblest image that can be made is at any rate on the mental plane, and therefore far easier for the ego to reach than is a physical body two whole planes lower down. If the friend who is loved is still alive, he will of course be entirely unaware down here on the physical plane that his true self is enjoying this additional manifestation. But this in no way affects the fact that that manifestation is a more real one and contains a nearer approximation to his true self than this lower one, which is all that most of us can as yet see. An interesting point is that since a man may well enter into the heaven life of several of his departed friends at once, he may thus be simultaneously manifesting himself in all these various forms, as well as, perhaps, managing a physical body down here. That conception, however, presents no difficulty to anyone who understands the relation of the different planes to one another. It is just as easy for him to manifest himself in several of these celestial images at once, as it is for us to be simultaneously conscious of the pressure of several different articles against different parts of our body. The relation of one plane to another is like that of one dimension to another. No number of units of the lower dimension can ever equal one of the higher, and in just the same way, no number of these manifestations could exhaust the power of response in the ego above. On the contrary, such manifestations afford him an appreciable additional opportunity for development on the mental plane, an opportunity which is the direct result and reward under the operation of the law of divine justice of the actions or qualities which evoked such an outpouring of affection. It is clear from all this that as the man evolves, his opportunities in all directions become greater. Not only is he more likely as he advances to attract the love and reverence of many, and so to have many strong thought images at his disposal on the mental plane, but also his power of manifestation through each of these and his receptivity in it rapidly increase with his progress. This was very well illustrated by a simple case which recently came under the notice of our investigators. It was that of a mother who had died perhaps 20 years ago, leaving behind her two boys to whom she was deeply attached. Naturally, they were the most prominent figures in her heaven, and quite naturally, too, she thought of them as she had left them, as boys of 15 or 16 years of age. The love which she thus ceaselessly poured out upon these mental images was really acting as a beneficent force showered down upon the grown up men in this physical world. But it did not affect them both to the same extent. Not that her love was stronger for one than the other, but because there was a great difference in the vitality of the images themselves. Not a difference, be it understood, that the mother could see. To her, both appeared equally with her and equally all that she could possibly desire. Yet, to the eyes of the investigators, it was very evident that one of these images was very much more instinct with living force than the other. On tracing this very interesting phenomena to its source, it was found that in one case, the son had grown up into an ordinary man of business, not specially evil in any way, but by no means spiritually minded, while the other had become a man of high unselfish aspiration and of considerable refinement and culture. His life had been such as to develop a much greater amount of consciousness in the soul than his brother's, and consequently, this higher self was able to vitalize much more fully that image of his youthful days which his mother had formed in her heaven life. There was more soul to put in, and so the image was vivid and living. Further research revealed number of similar instances, and it was very clearly seen that the more highly a soul is evolved in spirituality, the more fully he can express himself in such manifestations as his friend's love has provided for him. And by such fuller expression he is also enabled to derive more and more benefit from the living force of that love as it pours itself upon him through these thought images. As the soul grows, these images become fuller expressions of him, till when he gains the level of a master, he consciously employs them as a means of helping and instructing his pupils. Along these lines, only is conscious communication possible between those still imprisoned in the physical body and those who have passed into this celestial realm. As has been said, a soul may be shining out gloriously through his image in a friend's heaven life, and yet, in his manifestation through the physical body on this plane, that soul may be entirely unconscious of all this, and so may suppose himself unable to communicate with his departed friend. But if that soul has evolved his consciousness to the point of unification, and can therefore use his full powers while still in the physical body, he can then realize, even during this dull earthly life, that he still stands face to face with his friend as of yore, that death has not removed the man he loved, but has only opened his eyes to the grander, wider life which ever lives around us all. In appearance, the friend would seem much as he did in earth life, yet somehow strangely glorified. In the mind body, as in the astral body, there is a reproduction of the physical form within the outer void, whose shape is determined by that of the causal body, so that it has somewhat the appearance of a form of denser mist surrounded by a lighter mist. All through the heaven life, the personality of the last physical life is distinctly preserved, and it is only when the consciousness is finally withdrawn into the causal body that this feeling of personality is merged in the individuality, and the man, for the first time since this descent into incarnation, realizes himself as the true and comparatively permanent ego. Men sometimes ask whether on this mental plane there is any consciousness of time, any alternation of night and day, of sleeping and waking. The only waking in the heaven world is the slow dawning of this wonderful bliss upon the mind sense as the man enters upon his life on that plane. And the only sleeping is the equally gradual sinking into happy unconsciousness when the long term of that life at length comes to an end. It was once described to us in the beginning as a sort of prolongation of all the happiest hours in a man's life, magnified 100-fold in bliss. And though that definition leaves much to be desired, as indeed all physical plane definitions must, it still comes far nearer the truth than this idea of day and night. There is indeed what seems an infinity of variety in the happiness of the heaven world, but the changes of sleeping and waking form no part of its plan. On the final separation of the mind-body from the astral, a period of blank unconsciousness usually supervenes, varying in length between very wide limits, analogous to that which usually follows physical death. The awakening from this into active mental consciousness closely resembles what often occurs in waking from a night's sleep. Just as on first awakening in the morning, one sometimes passes through a period of intensely delightful repose, during which one is conscious of the sense of enjoyment, though the mind is as yet inactive and the body hardly under control, so the entity awakening into the heaven world first passes through a more or less prolonged period of intense and gradually increasing bliss before his full activity of consciousness on that plane is reached. When first this sense of wondrous joy dawns on him, it fills the entire field of his consciousness. But gradually, as he awakens, he finds himself surrounded by a world peopled by his own ideals and presenting the features appropriate to the subplane to which he has been drawn.